This lecture is about how to write a framework to NC. Sort of literally, like what is the process that you are doing in a debate so that you can win with framework. Okay. Step 0. Before we think about framework, we have to realize that a framework debate is just like every other debate. You should answer arguments in the order presented, and affirmative arguments are not frequently inscrutable. They are, in fact, frequently quite wrong. It would be a shame if you decided, oh, I can no longer read framework because you heard the argument that fiat was a microaggression and you just were like, oh, man, I can't fiat anymore. It's racist. That, while it's good to have the empathy and the reflexivity to understand your opponent's positions, it's bad to immediately dismiss any possible action without critical scrutiny. So we should attempt to understand affirmative arguments and work with them in order to figure out, to draw conclusions upon them. But effective framework debaters, when they are debating, go into debates with the mindset that, one, there is nothing inherently wrong with what they're defending, so we've been assigned a resolution. The AF needs to say yes, the neg needs to say no, and that process of debating is good. That resolution might contain certain assumptions. It says should, which implies that we should understand whether or not the consequences of an action are good, or decide whether it is moral in some way or not. And it generally asks for a policy position, so defending policy might be inevitable or good. So there's nothing wrong with that sentiment. The second way framework debaters go in is that they use their intuition and they trust it. So this is something you sort of hone over the course of your debate career, but a lot of the times when you come up with the first argument against a topicality argument or your first thought against it, it's generally not in the wrong direction. So um, when you hear fiat as a microaggression and you're innately like, I'm suspect of whether or not that is true, it might be worthwhile to follow that instinct and you can't just like make the claim, but you have to like develop a warrant for it, but that general instinct will guide you pretty effectively through most framework debates. And if it doesn't, you sort of need to develop a means to um, exist in these debates. Otherwise, through templates or something else that will allow you to answer most DAs. So it's good to question assumptions about the argument you're making, so you shouldn't be uncritically reflective and believe that you're always right and end up making arguments that could be problematic. But you should be channeling that sentiment into working through those hard places and being able to defend. Okay, the other way you could say this is you keep your eye on the ball. You figure out where the debate is going and you immediately attack it. And the way you hit a baseball is not just by like guessing where it's going to be, but actually, you know, making sure you see it and you hit the ball. Okay. Um, if one wouldn't agree with those premises and they couldn't, um, they find it in them, it's hard to defend topicality or they see a lot of merit in their opponent's positions. Other options against critical affirmatives will be more effective because if you're disheartened by the truth of your position, um, it seems like it would be pretty difficult to defend it. So um, there are other options, the capitalism K, impact turns, like, um, you could say hegemony is good, but I imagine that would have the same sort of moral conundrum as topicality, or you could read picks out of words in the plan or different parts of the affirmatives rhetoric, and that would be an effective strategy that has won many debates. Okay, so before the tournament is an important part of writing a framework to NC because framework doesn't a lot of the parts of framework debates are reusable and they are in a lot of debates. Now that's not to say you shouldn't tailor your blocks to the debate you are in. But the more we do before the tournament, the easier it is to tailor our stuff to a specific debate. So um, it is helpful to sort of think about the questions that are in this document because they're how you defend framework. So what is debate? Well, we think it's a game where we're going to make arguments, and at the end of the round, we'll win or we'll lose. We're power matched after the end of that round, and then we prep judges that will help us win, and we assume judges are going to flow debates and evaluate debates impartially. Um, that's what the framework team would say that debate's about. Um, and the reason why that matters is because debate debate is innately a competitive mechanism, a competitive format. So one, it's kind of hard to effectively channel the energy of debate, i.e., the process of debating, to the most effective advocacy. So we don't learn the most about everything we're debating. We do learn how to beat it, or we learn where the right parts are, but it doesn't innately create a strategic ally with a position. So let's say that the affirmative says it's good to have debates about settler colonialism. Having repeated debates about settler colonialism does not necessarily mean that the AF or the NEG is going to become more left-leaning or believe in the veracity of the settler colonialism critique. Instead, it suggests that um, teams will find out how to win against it. They'll find good arguments and bad arguments against it, um, but it might not directly shape like literally what people think about it. And the second part of this is that because debate is a game, there are incentives for affirmative teams and negative teams to decide what wins, not what is right. Um, so, for example, the microaggression K is treated with some general disdain by a lot of K debaters because it is like obviously like incorrect. Like it is pretty um, I want to say reductive to suggest that everything is a microaggression, including fiat, whatever, and it trivializes the value of that term and how we talk about racism in debate. Um, so the idea is that it will never create the most radical people, but the way that but influence the way people want to win debates. Okay. Before the debate continued, you will want to have asked the questions, what is debate? Why does it matter? Um, and then you'll choose, a type of impact. And there are generally two camps of framework, or two or three. Um, the first is fairness. And whenever you're explaining fairness, uh, you also need to work with the question, why does it matter? Um, a lot of beginner framework debaters will start with um, like we know the AF is unfair, like all of these AFs, there are so many of them, and we're not able to prepare with all of them. And that's a good explanation of the internal link to fairness, so we can tell why things are unfair, but it's hard to explain why fairness matters in itself. It's sort of taken as like a taken for granted in a lot of debates. So one explanation of why fairness matters is that because debate is a competition, fairness should be innately important. That teams come into debate expecting an equal opportunity to win. They want judges to evaluate fairly. They expect their opponents not to clip or to get coaching in the debates. And they introduce the 1AC expecting they have the potential to win. And that because debates start when the negative responds, um, denying rejoinder, i.e., being unfair, negates the value of introducing the 1AC into debate. That it is a value, we think that suffering is bad, we think that fairness is good, and that's how their impacts exist in morality. So impacts are based on inequality, like racism is bad, colonialism, etc. And the reason those are bad is not only because of suffering, but because it is unequal suffering. So that importantly describes how we morally explain many. This is often explained as an intrinsic impact, i.e., that the reason fairness matters is because it matters in itself. So it's hard to explain morally why happiness is good in a utilitarian sense, because happiness is literally the definition of good. Things are good, because they make people feel better. This is equivalent to why it's hard to explain why fairness matters. To effectively explain the impact in a debate sense, you should think about why it matters that you can win. Um, this could be personal, or well, like I cut so many of these cards and I wasted all of my life writing the affirmative that says that, the protection of intellectual property is extremely valuable, and I wanted to have debates about this, and the more we don't talk about those things, the more it wastes the time of countless students like me who come into debate and expect an equal chance of victory, blah, 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 blah. Or it could be more like abstract, sort of how these are, but you should explain fairness in the way that you can explain it matters to you. Uh, the next part of this is why clash matters. So generally, this is a part that's a little more difficult to explain as an external impact, um, because it seems more internal link-y, I guess. So the clash argument is generally that the point of debate is disagreement. The reason the 1AC is presented is presumably to suggest that we should respond, so we should be more able to respond effectively and specifically. This is a lot like the argument on fairness, that we have introduced it to respond. Um, why does it matter that we get to respond though? Um, there are two like possible interpretations of this generally, so that first we could learn about the topic. Um, that the more debates we have about the topic, the more we're going to be able to do something good in the future. So because I had 10 debates about Arctic policy, I will now be able to help people in Alaska find a house or something. The next is skills, like generally. So regardless of the content of the debate, we learn how to advocate generally things better, regardless of what they are. This is generally why Clash is seen as more of an internal link rather than an impact, because it, in this way, it's vague. So um, this is the same problem with like impacts that are treated as um, disjunctive instead of conjunctive, because they're less specific. They're probably more true, but it's hard to describe them. Um, Same thing for fairness. It's generally better as like a turns case type of argument than it is an external impact, because if you're going for like the skills type clash, uh, it is pretty risky because it's hard to describe the external impact. It requires you to essentially straight turn every DA, that their model doesn't solve it and only your model does, which is pretty difficult with a well-prepared opponent. Okay, now that we've talked about those things, here are just like blocks that you need before your first framework debate. You need an overview about what you think debate looks like. So that's the stuff above, debate's a game, etc. You'll need an impact overview. So that's how you'll explain fairness or how you'll explain clash. You'll want a general template for how to answer counterinterpretations. So they don't meet their interpretation, they link to their offense, it links to limits, like the idea that there are too many AFs, links to arbitrariness, that it's a self-serving interpretation that was chosen in the 2AC, or that links to ground. All of these things are possible things to include in your template. And then you'll also want an idea of how to respond to common DAs. So what's your take on state bad? What's your take on skills bad? Or unfairness is good because of structural unfairness in this glow? Or that fiat's bad? Those types of arguments. Okay, constructing the speech in the pre-round. You want to start with things that will be relevant regardless of the 2AC. You want your overview, your impact exclamation, your answers to counterinterps, your extension of your interpretation, etc. So here is me literally doing this. So I make a speech doc in verbatim. I suggest, oh no, I've been paired against KF. I label the document. I go back to my framework file. I tilde things in. I tilde in my overview, the role of the judge, fairness, interp, debate doesn't shape subjectivity, answer to counterinterp, switch side debate. I decide I'm going to put in clash as well, and that competing interps are good, because I think those are generally a set of arguments that enter a lot of framework debates. Okay? That's the value of preparing all of this in advance. That's probably 3.5 minutes of your speech, and the parts of the speech that will win you the debate already written. Your offense is there. All you need to do is figure out how to answer their offense. We have our basic framework 2NC. What do we do from here? My suggestion is to read the 1AC closely. Okay. This is me close reading a 1AC. This is the JDI Camp 1AC. The first thing I do is I make a header that has the card tag, or card author, and I'm literally just reading the highlighted parts of the 1AC. And I'm, picking out lines that I think are possible framework DAs. So I saw stories are easy to consume. I thought this seems like a K of the way people understand impacts. I saw this damage-centered thing. I also thought this seemed like a native suffering reps K. I say it's a native suffering reps K. Uh, and the labels probably aren't perfect at this point, but right now I'm just trying to get a feel for what these are supposed to be. Um, I see this. The first tag says something about debate centered around the state. I imagine it's going to be like state fiat bad. I'm trying to find where the lines are for that. So this says passive consumption of stories. I thought that sounds like a way they will say that fiat's bad, that we passively consume stories instead of actively engage with them. And then I looked at this line, alternative knowledges and practices are marginalized. Marginalized seems like a big action verb, so I thought that was an impact. Um, and then I looked through all of this, and it seems like the power discrepancies, who can participate in policy making, that seems like people will be unable to access your skills, so that we don't know how to policy make. Okay, I read this card, and this card seems like a topic link. It seems effective at some things, but it's not particularly effective at responding to framework. So I thought, or it was incorporated in arguments above. So I didn't think it was new or something that would be a framework disadvantage. Okay, advocacy text. Practice of alter life research. I thought, okay, this clearly doesn't even say anything about the Arctic. Um, so it seems like it would have to be pretty big. Even if alter life research might be like their cards are specific to the Arctic, it seems like it won't be very limited. And they didn't use any resolutional language or anything. Um, but I noted here that if they used more resolutional language, that might be more likely to see a debate about counterinterpretations and definitions than one you'd see here. Okay, I read this. It seemed like um, it was a colonialism impact thing, and that imagining anti-colonial things is good, or decolonial rather. this is, you know, basically as explicit a K of persuasion as I think you can see. Who am I trying to persuade? We're describing the Arctic as void. What do we do in debates? So this is they're both suggesting alternative means of debate and criticizing your method of persuasion. So if you say something about persuasion, that will probably be relevant. Um, you should be interested in taking sides. I think I just blow this up. It's like the most obvious critique of switch side debate I think they could write. Um, that instead of not taking sides, we should take sides. I will write switch side debate K. I try to read it. Um, seems like an Academy K. Academy bad. I find the line. I am interested in taking sides. And then the last lines, I didn't highlight them here, but they're like liberal inclusion is bad. Seemed like a K of switch side debate or TVA. That seems similar. This also seemed like an answer to the TVA. This seemed to have a K of universal humanity, extinction type rhetoric that says this is good for everyone. So there was my read of the 1AC. Okay, so why do you do that? Um, if you get good at doing this, you will basically know a K team's 2AC to framework 25 minutes before they give it. So if we imagine in the 5 minutes it takes to get the pairing, walk to your room, open up their wiki, um, and like open up a speech doc. It took a minute to tilde everything in, so we probably have like 20 more minutes of pre-round. Um, and then we've got a 1AC and a 1NC and some cross-X's. That's all time where you can start writing your 2NC to framework really, um, and figuring out what it's going to be. Their 2AC to framework is either going to be really connected to the 1AC or not particularly effective at making its point. I wrote bad here because if the 2AC is disconnected from the 1AC, then they have wasted a speech. Um, and judges in K debates especially like clear argumentative narrative and to understand why the 1AC said what it did. If the 2AC is totally disconnected from the 1AC, it is not very effective. So you shouldn't really fret about that. If they read new answers or anything, or like new framework things, that's probably good for you and bad for them because they got a speech less to explain what they meant. The next thing we do is answer what we think their DAs are. Okay? So here I start with their first DA. I think no link. Why does the Arctic policy innately create voyeurism is my initial thought. So their other AFs are not going to be about native suffering. And even if they're about exploration and development, they might not innately include indigenous perspectives. I kind of thought I don't really want to say that exactly because, you know, if they don't include indigenous perspectives, that also seems to link to their offense. So I thought both apps will talk about things that are not indigenous violence, which doesn't link to your native suffering reps K, and that there will be apps that do talk about native people, but those will not be damage centered. That because fiat exists and they're desiring a possible action, um, that is an example of desire-based research that would solve the reason that they think voyeurism is bad. Um, so Other apps might talk about native suffering, but they are desire-based. Okay. Their model links as well. Um, because the app might have impacts about, native suffering, that seems relevant to um, include in a model of debate, because if they include the same impacts of native suffering or whatever, and they aren't innately desire-centered, those would likely thump their impact. It means their model of debate is not effective at solving the reasons that native suffering exists in, or native suffering reps are bad, so that they're damage-centered and not desire-centered. So I make that argument that they cause people to center native suffering. And then lastly, switch side debate seems to solve the negative. Should be able to say that if an app includes native suffering reps, those native suffering reps are bad. This is still before the 2AC is delivered, by the way. Okay, so I've done that. You should generally think of a template, no link, they don't solve. The switch side debate or TVA solves it. Um, if you don't have another instinctive answer, those are what you should try to say to every DA. You should just repeat that process until they give the 2AC. Um, now, part of other the other part of this is figuring out what to do in 1AC cross X, and you'll want to sort of ask questions that um, aren't like, why is this linked to framework or anything like that. You sort of want to be like, in this context, like, what about research is not colonial? Why is that innately true? Um, but you you should mostly be trying to work on this type of uh, practice until the 2AC is given. Then, when they give the 2AC, you want to flow and pay attention to the language they use to explain their impacts. You also want to pay attention to the depth of each DA, so if it's short or it doesn't make a lot of sense, it's probably not going to be the 2AR. And once we've given that, effective 1AC cross-X, they'll probably also give away the 2AR on framework. So you should ask them, like, what about traditional research is bad? And their answer will be the framework DA. And then the cross-X of the 1NC will normally be their desired approach against T. Then, when the 2AC is given, here's a 2AC here, we look at our thing and compare it to the 2AC. Uh, it seems like this fits right in, but we might want to change some of the language. So instead of our voyeurism words, we change it to the words they said, which is necrotic resurrection. Um, then just verifying, that's the same thing as that. State centrism DA, it was the fiat K. The persuasion DA, I skipped a card, then I went to, oh, there's the persuasion DA. False inclusion, seems like they're K of the TVA. And then they've read a couple extra DAs, which, may or may not talk about the things that are the other things in the app, but all of it seems to connect to our idea of what we thought the 2AC was going to be. Okay, they're the same. The difference, once we've finished this, is to use affirmative language to answer DAs. So we should change what our things before were saying into what we learn the 2AC actually wants to say. And if they add additional DAs, we'll do the same process, either with a template or using our instinctive responses to arguments to um, attempt to respond to framework. Hope this was helpful.